and one in the Revolution of 1776, the freedom to govern themselves. Wherever our listeners are right now, and I do know that I have some listeners that are celebrating this decision. I would say most of our listeners are very concerned about it. But however, you've got to be a little bit concerned that here 5 Supreme Court justices basically could overturn the will of 41 million Americans, and to do it in such a cavalier way.
Absolutely. I think you're going to have people say, well, look, this is what we had go on in this decision is a proper application of the process because the majority was simply protecting a constitutional right. But this cuts right into interpretation and what we mean by the Constitution's text, meaning, and thus our views on how it should be applied and whose freedom is being protected here. What the majority has done here is said, well, under the 14th Amendment, we are going to create this right as protected. Okay, that sounds fine on its face, but what you've now done is you've nullified the millions of voters in the states who disagree with that view, who say, I'm part of America too, I want to live in a free country, and yet my freedom is being trampled here by the Supreme Court's purported protection of an individual right, but in reality, dismissal of the voters' autonomy and a free exercise of their vote. So, this is played out in interpretation, but what you have summarized and encapsulated is at the heart of this case, and it comes to the fore when the majority says, we're trying to protect a right here, but in reality they're twisting the meaning of the Constitution, which is our ultimate source of law, a positive law, hard law in the United States, twisting its meaning, and thus trampling the freedom of many based on that twisting of the meaning.
Talking with Travis Weber, who's the director of the Center for Religious Liberty at the Family Research Council. We've posted a number of his articles on our website, pointofview.net. Of course, those will take you back to frc.org. And of course, we had Tony Perkins with us on Friday. But one more point out of your article, you remind us, going back 2 years ago, that in the Windsor case, essentially the court was saying, we don't want the lower courts to actually precede this. In other words, let's just sort of let this play out. But essentially, first the lower courts, some of those federal courts, and then now the Supreme Court violated the very instructions they seem to have given out.
Oh yeah, well yeah. I mean, this isn't the first time we've seen this, but it certainly does delegitimize the courts and the judiciary when people see this, two-faced application, decision making here. And the ignoring previous decisions, and basically in this case blatantly ignoring reasoning in Windsor, which said that marriage is a matter to be left to the states. I think it was one of the dissents. I'm trying to. I'll find it here. One of the dissents actually quoted the Windsor majority and said, "Well, how much clearer can we get in terms of this contradiction when you have a Windsor majority saying marriage is to be left to the states, and yet look at what they're doing today." So, at the end of the day, what this does is disillusions people to the role the Supreme Court can play as a credible, objective decision maker whose word can be relied on. And as Justice Scalia said, in the minds of many, this only increases the dismissive attitude towards the court that people will have, and the sidelining of the court in their minds. Certainly the court will make decisions that people disagree with on various issues as a matter of law, but it shouldn't be because of an interjection of social policy views by the majority of the court. Yeah. People disagree should be over legal interpretation, and here, unfortunately, it's blatantly obvious. The court has just imposed its view on people as on a matter of social policy.
Again, one of the other articles we've posted here today, Andrew McCarthy, let's drop the charade. The Supreme Court is a political branch, not a judicial one. We'll talk about that. But also, Travis Weber's written this question very good. What about whether or not this would threaten the tax-exempt status of educational institutions, churches, and others? We'll talk about that with much more right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
The story earlier this month was that the Treasury Department was planning to take Alexander Hamilton off the $10 bill. An unnamed woman would replace him on the money. The most recent announcement is that his image won't disappear completely, but remain in a secondary way. The announcement from the Treasury Department created a small stir. It would have been a huge controversy if it weren't for the ignorance of most Americans of the contribution of Alexander Hamilton. He fought alongside George Washington as a colonel and provided advice to Washington both as a member of his staff and even later continued in that role when Washington served as his first president. Hamilton wrote 3/5 of the Federalist Papers along with James Madison and John Jay. His writings on judicial review were important in the formation and functioning of the first Supreme Court. We should also mention his other writings. Alexander Hamilton was a journalist and helped found the New York Evening Post. You know it today as the New York Post. These reasons enough should be reasons he should be on our money, but the most important reason is that Alexander Hamilton was the nation's first Treasury Secretary. Most people credit him with saving the country from our first debt crisis and establishing a national bank. His place in history should be secure, but now we are told that he will be replaced by a woman. Here are a few women who have been mentioned. Alice Paul, Phyllis Wheatley, Deborah Sampson, Sylvia Rivera, Lydia Maria Child, and Sojourner Truth are not exactly household names. A few other women you might have heard about are Harriet Tubman, Susan B. Anthony, and Eleanor Roosevelt. Here's a possible test. The woman to replace Hamilton should at least have read the 85 Federalist Papers he wrote and know something about judicial review and the banking system that Alexander Hamilton helped create. Few, if any, of these proposed nominees could pass that simple test. I'm not ready to replace America's first Treasury Secretary who wrote a majority of the Federalist Papers with someone who never even read the Federalist Papers. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about the issue of same-sex marriage and also the implications that it might have for you, your family, and your church. 1-800-351-1212. Since calls are already coming in, I might as well open up the phones. 1-800-351-1212. Travis Weber with us, and he is the director of the Center for Religious Liberty at the Family Research Council. You can read a number of his articles that we have posted, and we'll take some of your phone calls in just a minute. Travis, any comments about the 14th Amendment? I love, again, what Justice Scalia said, because the argument is that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment was enough to strike down all of these different laws and amendments and other things. And he said the 5 justices who compose today's majority are entirely comfortable concluding that every state violated the Constitution for all of the 135 years between the 14th Amendment's ratification and Massachusetts permitting of same-sex marriages in 2003. I did not know that when the framers of the 14th Amendment actually were using this to protect the protection of African Americans, that they had in the back of their minds gay marriage. I just did not know that. Travis, did you?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's obviously, the point is clear and well taken. Why is that? Because it's quite obvious that the court is shifting with the times, shifting with what they perceive as public or, quote, acceptable, unquote, opinion on this matter, and thus tailoring their decision to that opinion. It's quite obvious they are. And so in order to contort their result in that way, of course they have to get around what the law says, what our history says, what the original intent and meaning of various constitutional provisions have said, and the degree, the radical degree to which they have to contort themselves is illustrated by your question and the obvious answer that no, this was never a part of what's supposed to be protected by the Constitution, and the degree to which this departs from that feeds into my concern raised earlier. The court is only delegitimizing itself more because in the minds of any ordinary observer, this is a ridiculous legal result. And so, it's, I completely agree with your point there.
Sure. Well, and again, I don't want to push this too far, but there are at least two justices I think should have recused themselves, and that 5-4 decision would have been a 4-3 decision the other way. But we'll leave that as it is because I want to get to the bigger issue that I think affects almost all of our listeners if they attend church or if they have 501c3 organizations they support. And that is that you might be able to argue that legalizing same-sex marriage isn't affecting marriage. I think it is, but we'll leave that on the table. But it also has the implication of threatening the tax-exempt status of all sorts of organizations. And earlier this month, you wrote a piece entitled Same-Sex Marriage Threatens Tax-Exempt Status of Educational Institutions. And that has to do with the fact that in the oral arguments, when Justice Alito was asking the Solicitor General, Donald Verrilli, about this issue, looking back at the Bob Jones case in the 1980s, Donald Verrilli kind of let the cat out of the bag and said, it's going to be an issue. Kind of a nice way of saying, yeah, we probably will come after some of these 501c3 organizations that don't go along with this idea of marriage equality. Your thoughts?
No, I completely agree. I mean, the government's admitted that they're considering this option. Now, we'll have to wait and see what they do for sure, but the fact that they're admitting this oral argument shows that at a minimum it's on the table. And what in their minds they would be doing is viewing any support for natural marriage as so odious and outside of the norm that organizations supporting it don't deserve any sort of protection, or not a protection, but preference for a tax-exempt status in order to further the public good as a matter of public policy. This just shows the degree to which people considering this in elite academia and government positions are out of touch with the role that religion plays in society. In their minds, they just can't conceive of any normal or rational position support of Orthodox religions who align themselves with support of natural marriage. And they don't understand the role these organizations play in society in all sorts of areas that escape their notice day to day. Caring for their communities, counseling people, supporting ministries to the poor, and various things like that. So, this is an issue, and it needs to be addressed by the public discussion taking place and showing the good that religious organizations do in communities across the U.S. and internationally, and where we would be without them. And it also has to take place along the lines of a classical view of civil liberties, and this continue to be advanced and pushed back against the progressive mindset that everyone must conform. This classical view must prevail, and people must be left free in their private affairs to generally believe and act as they see fit. And so those are the two ways in which this very very out-of-touch, poor mindset must be addressed.
Well, again, Travis Weber with us, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. One of the questions I want to put on the table, is it time to withdraw the tax-exempt status of all these different organizations? You can see there's a very significant essay that appeared in Time magazine arguing for that, and really going beyond just the churches, but saying, why should Yale University in the middle of New Haven, Connecticut, having gone there, I know what that's like, have that kind of tax-exempt status? Why should this prep school benefit? Why should these churches benefit? And so that is a question certainly on the table today, just as the shooting in Charleston, South Carolina, became very quickly a debate about whether or not we could have Confederate flags available in various stores and those kinds of things, or whether or not that could fly the Confederate flag over a particular state-owned piece of property. I wonder if the debate developing about same-sex marriage could become a justification for a conversation about, maybe even a push towards removing the tax-exempt status of various educational institutions. And if you'd like to to read a little bit more about that, Travis Weber's piece is posted on our website. Of course, you can go to frc.org to do so. Let's take some phone calls. What would you like to add to the conversation today? We'll go to California first, KLMB. Kathy, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, today, Saturday, the Magna Carta, its birthday was last Saturday. Anyways, my thing is the enumerated powers have been taken away from the people, because that's why we, the people, by the people, for the people. That's what the Constitution reads. It doesn't, and by can be a singular, but when 9 or 5 can decide for 40 million people, isn't that taking the enumerated powers out of the hands of the people?
Yeah, well, it happened a long time ago. A couple of things. First of all, Magna Carta, 800th birthday. I did a commentary on it, which we have posted on the website. But let me come back to you, Travis, because most of us learned in school that you had certain powers which were delegated to the federal government, those enumerated powers, but the rest were reserved to the states and the people. And there were supposed to be some checks and balances. But if I read Justice Scalia right, he says we now have a ruler over the 320 million Americans, and that ruler are the 5 people that agree with each other on the Supreme Court.
No, I think that characterization is correct, at least in this case, and in a alarmingly expanding number of other cases in areas of law. I think it boils down to several reasons. I think the focus on the judicial philosophy, the conception of the role of judges and the judiciary in the minds of at least, I think, 5 of these Supreme Court justices and other lower court judges is one of breaking the tie when on the fence in favor of interceding and solving social problems. They view themselves as social problem solvers and settling tough issues. Shouldn't be the role under the clear and original layout and text of our Constitution as it explains the separation of powers between the different branches. So I think that's kind of resulted in a shift and twist to the original role because of this mindset that we shall intervene and solve these social problems. I think there are other areas of interpretation, substantive due process interpretation, and other issues which led to the result here. But as was expressed by the caller, there certainly are at the very core issues of judicial philosophy and a conception of separation of powers, which has caused us to go astray here.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll take some more phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Another issue put on the table was raised by Chief Justice John Roberts, the issue of polygamy. He said, although the majority randomly inserts the adjective to in various places, it offers no reason as to why a 2-person element is the core definition of marriage. So we'll talk about that. But again, we are coming to the end of our fiscal year, which ends tomorrow. So if you appreciate the kind of news, commentary, interviews that we provide, we certainly do encourage you to take action immediately. We have an opportunity for you to give, and it is a matching fund that we have established. So that means your gift of $100 becomes $200. We're trying to transform lives, trying to have a positive impact in the culture, and we encourage you to visit the website pointofview.net and make your gift. We'll be right back.
It's just really scary to think where I would be if it hadn't been for the influence Point of View had on my life.
That is Jamie Jordan, a successful businessman who's been listening to Point of View since he was a child. Jamie says this program helped develop his worldview, which is exactly why Kerby does what he does.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
If you believe the next generation needs that education and empowerment, we need to hear from you today. Our fiscal year ends tomorrow, and when you give now, some ministry friends will match your gift. You give 30, they give 30. You give 100, they give 100. Double your impact by giving online at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Or mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
In my childhood, pre-internet, the radio played a fairly large role. I remember hearing Point of View come on the radio and Marlon Maddox and the introduction to global perspectives on what God and His people are doing throughout the earth. Even when I was a young child, and even when that content was almost in the background of family life or of commuting or being dropped off at sporting activities, there was a sense, and it created a sense within me, that there were people in the world who were leading well, following Jesus, communicating the gospel, and applying that to our lives and our cultural experiences. And I think that that impact definitely shaped how I thought about my faith, even as a child, and what the Lord expected of me and the community that He would provide around me to fulfill the purposes for my life. All of us need understanding. Scripture says, seek, gain, look for, apply understanding in our lives. And really, understanding is about understanding a narrative, a story, especially in the 21st century where we have so many stories, so much information, so many competing narratives coming against us. We have to understand God's narrative and our role in that. And of course, Christian radio, and specifically Point of View, is touching thousands and millions of lives across the world and equipping people to walk in that worldview.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again,
is Kerby Anderson. Okay, let's open the phones. We're certainly going to spend a little more time for a few minutes talking with Travis Weber, but we also want to talk with you. What are your thoughts and comments about the decision that came down Friday, and a couple of questions I certainly have for you. What about this tax-exempt status? Do you think that would have an impact on your church or Christian organizations you support? What about the comments that you received maybe from your pastor on Sunday? Did he address these issues at all? And we'll get into a couple of other topics, but if you'd like to join us, we're going to spend some time hearing from you. 1-800-351-1212. But Travis, I wanted to pick up another point, and that's the word advocate. Justice Anthony Kennedy, writing for the majority, said, quote, "Religions and those who adhere to religious doctrines may continue to advocate with utmost and sincere conviction that by divine precept, same-sex marriage should not be condoned." Okay, so, and he goes on to say the First Amendment actually assures that. So, on the one hand, he says, well, you can make your opinion known about this, but if I look at the dissents, and tell me if I'm missing something here, Clarence Thomas said, religious liberty is about more than just the protection of religious organizations and persons as they seek to teach the principles that are so fulfilling and so central to their lives and faith. Justice Roberts, he said the majority graciously suggests that religious believers might continue to advocate and teach their views of marriage, but the First Amendment, however, gives the freedom to exercise their religion. Am I making too much of that, or is there a problem here?
No, I think there's definitely a problem between the language of the majority and the dissents. Or I should say there's a problem with the majority of the language. The majority's language here in its limited view of the freedom of religion. This view that the freedom of religion just encompasses advocacy and speech does not comport with what our law protects. That's a way more limited view. And the dissents are correct to point out that the majority. The majority's view is very problematic in its limited nature and limited view of the freedom of religion. Even as the law stands now, it protects far more than the majority lets on. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is a broad statutory protection in comporting with free exercise. It's a broad statutory protection for the free exercise. This broad nature adequately. That being said, this decision dealt with the marriage issue. So the fact that they're addressing this is sort of tangential to the legal question, but if they're going to opine on it, they might as well opine accurately and express the contours of that freedom. And I would submit that their representation of the freedom of religion is not complete, it's not accurate, and we shouldn't go off of that as some guideline for where protections lie.
Sure. And again, what I want to try to do for just a minute, Travis, is educate my listeners to have a more discerning ear, because you have right now presidential candidates coming out, and a presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State, has talked about that we have the freedom of worship in America. Well, I would see that as very different than, say, when a Ted Cruz says, well, no, we have a lot more than freedom of worship. We have freedom of religion. Freedom of worship sort of sounds like, well, you're free to do whatever you want inside the church, but don't take it outside the church. Likewise, when you have Justice Kennedy saying, well, you're free to teach or advocate, but maybe not to exercise, we should pay attention to those words because, yeah, it could be that these words are just handled in a very sloppy way. But it could be that really behind those words is a very different perception of the First Amendment, don't you think?
Completely. And when we look at this, what's playing out here with these terms in the international context, what you've seen is attempts to separate freedom of worship from the freedom of religion. And you have many folks who say, well, the freedom of worship is fine, but you can't have the freedom of religion, which is defined broadly to include the practice and expression of beliefs, which also includes the freedom to attempt to persuade others of your beliefs. That's different in the minds of some in the international scene from this freedom to worship privately in your home. We can obviously see the difference in action and what these different conceptions permit people to do. And the reason this has arisen is because of the sensitivity of some in the Islamic context internationally to people trying to persuade Muslims away from their religion. Well, the human right of the freedom of religion includes the ability to freely express beliefs and persuade others of them. It's a broad right. It's not this notion that you just exist in your home and then shut off that element of your humanity when you proceed outside of your home. So this is equally problematic when we see it expressed domestically in a different way as people try to separate religion from the public square, remove it from any connection with the public square or the marketplace. It absolutely is a concern, and we need to be very careful to pay attention to when this happens.
So again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I'll start taking some phone calls in a minute, but I did mention just before we went to the break this issue of polygamy. I have said before that every argument for same-sex marriage could just as easily be an argument for polygamy. Chief Justice John Roberts put it this way. He said, although the majority randomly inserts the adjective to in various places, it offers no reason at all why the two-person element of the core definition of marriage may be preserved while the man-woman element may not. It's striking how much of the majority's reasoning would apply with equal force to the claim of a fundamental right to plural marriage. So I guess I'm not the only one saying that basically every argument for same-sex marriage could easily be an argument for polygamy or just about anything else.
It's a great point, and this was raised at the oral arguments. It's being raised now in the written opinion, because logically, when you look at the majority's logic, nothing limits them to marriages between two people. Frankly, the only limiting factor they've expressed, or the petitioners have expressed at the oral argument, is the notion that, well, that's all we're asking for at this point, or that's all that's being considered. Well, that's not very logical. It's not a very limiting. It's not very limiting at all.
Not very comforting either. Yes, it just sort of says, hey, this is just this is the first request, but we're going to come back with more in the future. Yeah. Let me take some phone calls just before we take a break, and then we're certainly going to encourage a lot more calls in that second hour, but we'll go to North Carolina this time. And WLGP. Andrea, thank you for calling.
Thank you, Kerby. I just wanted you to address, because I haven't heard it yet, and I know Penn will do it, but I guess it's just so complicated that it's hard to do. Would you please address, Kerby and your panel member, the doctrinal divisions and issues inside the Christian church? For example, in my city, you can go to the Unitarian church, and that's been on the news. I mean, the Unitarian church will marry same-sex couples. They've always been willing to do that. Episcopal churches, for example, on NPR this morning, and I won't say the name of the program, they're celebrating it. So, but within our denomination, with our Christian denomination, well, don't we need to? How are we going to do this? I mean, the United Methodist Church just ruled, Kerby, I know you heard about it, that they're going to accept it and go forward. The Episcopal Church already does. The Lutheran Church, I don't know. The Presbyterian Church has said they will go forward. The Unitarian Church has always done that. But what would you say to the divisions within the Christian churches, within the denomination? How are we to go forward as Christians as we fight this battle?
Well, I appreciate you bringing that up. Let's be a little more precise. You mentioned Presbyterian. Well, you look at Presbyterian USA versus PCA, I think you're going to see a difference. Let's take Lutherans. I would say the more conservative Lutherans would be Lutheran Missouri Synod, would be very different than, say, evangelical Lutherans. This is what I think is going to happen. And Travis, you can weigh in just a minute. We've been talking about the fact that what you may eventually have is kind of Church A and Church B, but they won't be on an equal status, because I think what will happen very quickly is if a particular denomination, or let's even talk about Catholics, because we've had John Smirek on here saying he knows of a few Catholic bishops and maybe even a diocese here and there that might allow same-sex marriage and others will not. What I think you could have very quickly is something, and permit me to use this hyperbole because it's not quite where I want to go, like China, where in China you have the state-sponsored churches and then you have the underground churches. Here you could have the churches eventually that say, we go along with same-sex marriage. We have no problem with that. They might be able to be allowed to keep their tax-exempt status. But as Justice Alito said in his opinion, this decision could be used to vilify Americans, and I could put in there vilify churches who are unwilling to assent to the new orthodoxy. And so then you'd have the other churches. And so I think you're going to see a split very quickly between those churches which are willing to compromise, which are fairly liberal and progressive anyway, might already be ordaining individuals that are homosexual, certainly have no problem with same-sex marriage, and others that do not. And I frankly think some of the liberal churches will be used as an excuse to say the other churches need to get along. Because imagine if you're in a Southern Baptist church or a conservative Methodist church, a conservative Lutheran church, where you're being told, well, they went along, why aren't you going along? So again, we'll look at that issue right after these important messages.
Many times, people who are older than me say they have given up hope on America. They don't believe that we can come back from the changes and challenges. The widespread promotion of anti-Christian beliefs is sweeping into courtrooms, schools, newsrooms, and homes. They are pushing to be mainstream and claiming the Bible and Christian beliefs are a thing of the past, or worse, bigoted. It is easy for the older generation to give up when America is so different now from the one they grew up with. But if you give up, where does that leave my generation and the ones behind me? I believe that we should stand and pray. The only one who can fix us and make America a shining light again is God. He promised his plans are to prosper his people and give us a hope and a future. Prayer is the best way we can act on the hope for a future. James wrote, "The fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much." I still believe that. If you believe God will shape the future by the prayers of his people, you can sign up to be a part of the Pray for America campaign at pointofview.net/pray.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. A few more minutes with Travis Weber. In the second hour, we really leave for your comments or questions, and we certainly do encourage you to call now. We'll set up those phone calls and take some more in just a minute. Travis, what about this? It does seem to me that this brings us back to something even we talked about with Tony Perkins on Friday, the need for Christians to stand strong. And I think right now what you're going to start seeing is a number of the liberal denominations or even liberal dioceses and other things just say, oh, we have no problem with that same-sex marriage. We'll marry them inside the church. That's going to bring a lot of pressure to the other churches and the other priests, pastors, and church leaders to capitulate. One, because, well, you want to be relevant, and two, maybe because your tax-exempt status might be risked. What about these particular concerns?
It's possible that people would think along those lines. I think this is primarily, and this goes back to what the caller raised, primarily a theological issue. Churches are going to have to examine what they really believe. and whether they actually believe what they say they believe. And if someone believes what they say they believe, they're going to be able to withstand pressure. So, this is a social pressure. This is an issue that's going to be sorted out as time goes on. I think it's important to have role models and examples where people say, these are my beliefs, and the state cannot compel me to sin and force me to violate my beliefs. At this point, the ruling binds state governments. It doesn't bind any private actors. It doesn't force churches to do anything. Some of these implications will be worked out as time goes on, but at this point, it's not requiring churches to do anything. So they're free to continue to believe and act as they have acted. It is not requiring them to reform same-sex marriages or anything like that. So, it's important for religious leaders to not think that this requires them to do anything or even puts pressure on them. This is a legal opinion with a legal implication that directly impacts states and no one else at this point. And, religious leaders should not think otherwise as they proceed onward from this point.
And again, they voted 9-0 in that one little paragraph there to say that should not affect religious liberty. I think that's nothing more than a paper protection, but we'll find out. But let's take some more phone calls. South Carolina, Guy, thank you for joining the conversation today. Travis Weber is our guest. What would you like to add?
Well, I was been listening over, the news and everything, and the governor of Mississippi has said they may just do away with marriages in that state completely. And I thought that was kind of a unique take on that. But my take would be just regulate it only to the clergy. And I agree. I told my wife as soon as I heard about it, I said, you got some denominations that would not have a problem with that at all. And it's going to just become a big headache for the Christians in America to have to deal with this.
One of the things that has been argued, Travis, by more than just a few people, both liberals and conservatives, interestingly enough, is let's take government out of the marriage business. My problem with that, and I'd love to hear your comments, is when you say, well, we'll just do away with marriage in Mississippi or whatever, we do have laws that are tied to marriage, and because you have things like divorce, you have to have the government sometimes step in and figure out, okay, are you married or not married? What about child support, alimony, all of those kinds of issues? If everybody stayed married, then the government would have a limited role. But the reality is, even if everybody stayed married, still by the time you talk about the distribution of property and things like that, that's one of the reasons government has a role in marriage. And of course, there's certain benefits that come to marriage. There's also some liabilities that the gay people never want to point out. That is, there's still a marriage penalty in our tax code. So the point is that as much as people want to just wave a wand and say, well, let's just get rid of government intervention in marriage, I'm not so sure how to do that. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts on that. I think, you correctly point out that the government is intertwined with marriage. It uses it to regulate various areas of the law. And it's not an easy thing to say, well, let's just, get it out of the law and then still deal with these various areas which it's used in the law. Beyond that, at a philosophical level, you have to remember, I think people have to remember that, the government is always sending a message. It's always, legitimizing something or delegitimizing something when it comes to this or other bestowal of benefits on human relationships. And so when the government says, let's get out of marriage, and then you have people regulating their marriages and showing up to the government saying, look, here's my marriage certificate, it's valid, and those people can get someone to marry them to a child, an animal, a plural marriage, polygamous marriage. Now, granted, these are not, I recognize there's differences between these relationships, and there may be other checks and limits that would prevent legal limits preventing some of these things from happening at this point. But philosophically, you have to recognize if we say that, we can't. The government can't then say, "Well, I'm not going to recognize your marriage," right? So the government then recognizes the marriage, and it's the government's then conferring the same legitimacy on any of those relationships as it would on a man-woman marriage. So, we think of government in terms of positive law, the police, the authorities, judges. But government goes to self-government, government of one's own morals, and the family. The family is an integral unit, and the family being able to govern itself has enabled this country to prosper freely over hundreds of years. What we're doing now is we're deconstructing, we're destroying that government, the foundation of government in the family unit. And if the government gets out of marriage totally, what it's doing is just getting out of, it's destroying the whole level of government and society ultimately. So then you're going to have the government speaking from a civil perspective, judges, police, what we traditionally think of as government, needing to step into that void and have a heavier hand of the state on all of our lives because we've destroyed a foundation of government, the family, that we don't think of as government traditionally. So there are deeper philosophical problems. Though this issue may sound good on its face at points, there are deeper philosophical problems when the government would get out of the marriage business.
Yes. Well, again, I appreciate the good work that you've done. We've posted quite a number of your articles here. The Supreme Court's marriage meddling 2 years later. Same-sex marriage threatens tax-exempt status of educational institutions. Of course, people can go to the Family Research Council, frc.org, to find more information. And I appreciate you giving us some time today and helping us understand this decision that came down on Friday.
Thanks. I appreciate having me on.
Travis Weber with us. We'll talk with him again. Of course, we talk with a lot of people at FRC and certainly wanted to give you a chance to get a sense of what the Supreme Court ruled and at the same time give you a chance to join the conversation. In this last hour, I don't have a guest, although I am going to be reading some very, I think, insightful pieces that come from people like Pastor Robert Jeffress, Jay Richards, two individuals have been on this program quite often. Andrew McCarthy has also been on this program. His one comment about the Supreme Court. Rod Dreyer, some others that have really been addressing that, and I'll even maybe read a little bit from Kelly Shackelford's piece today, although since he will be in studio tomorrow, we'll give him a chance to explain the piece that came out recently in Investors Business Daily and learn a little bit more about what that means in terms of religious liberty. So again, one of the things that I think we can do is give you a chance to address this issue. So if you have called in, we'll give you that opportunity, 1-800-351-1212. And I'll get to some of those phone calls right after the top of the hour. But also I want to remind you that we're just a day away from the end of our fiscal year end, and that is June 30th tomorrow. So please, if you have been thinking about supporting this ministry, never a better time right now than when we have a matching grant. This is a number of individuals that have said for your gift of $30, we'll add $30. For your gift of $100, we'll add $100. And again, we are in process of transforming lives, trying to be salt and light, educating you and empowering you. That's what we're all about. And if you believe in that, we certainly need to hear from you. Visit the website, pointofview.net. Click on the button. We'll be back with some of those phone calls right after this.
Business owner Jamie Jordan says he had a lot of wrong ideas, things he learned in school which just weren't true. But then he discovered a voice on the radio, and it changed his thinking and changed his future.
I started listening to Point of View in 1985. Marlon Maddox was the host back then, and I remember that he used to call it the Head in the Sand Club, that his kind of mission in life was to pull people's heads out of the sand, and my head certainly was in the sand. And it's just really scary to think where I would be if it hadn't been for the influence Point of View had on my life.
Our listeners have been inspired to do amazing things in business, in education, in ministry, in their families. And if you believe that should continue, then please help us before our fiscal year ends tomorrow. Every gift you give will be matched thanks to ministry friends. So double the impact of your most generous gift. Online at pointofview.net. By mail at Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or by phone 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I started listening to Point of View in 1985. We moved from Little Rock, Arkansas to Conroe, Texas. Marlon Maddox was the host back then, and I remember that he used to call it the head in the sand club, that his kind of mission in life was to pull people's heads out of the sand, and my head certainly was in the sand. And at the time I was a theistic evolutionist, because I believed what they taught about Genesis, and as far as God created the world, but I also went to public school and believed what they taught about evolution. I didn't really understand the intellectual conflict. The politics, didn't really understand. I was always kind of conservative by nature, but didn't really understand what was going on. And today, the lies from the dominant media culture are just so rampant. And Point of View is such a breath of fresh air to have the truth told. And a little light in a dark space makes a lot of light. You can be in a black dark cave and one little candle will light up everything. I think Point of View, more than anything besides my parents, has influenced my worldview and my thinking. And to me, it's just really scary to think where I would be if it hadn't been for the influence Point of View had on my life.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, open line for you if you would like to join our conversation today. 1-800-351-1212 will give you an opportunity to join the conversation, express your opinion, and we'd love to know what you think about this decision that has come down from the Supreme Court. And a little bit later, we'll get into some other issues. The Supreme Court today ruled on an issue related to the death penalty, so we'll talk about that. Of course, there's a crisis in Greece right now, and one of the other articles we've posted, where's the Pope's encyclical on Christian persecution? And so there are quite a number of things to talk about this hour, but most importantly, we want to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Before we take some phone calls, let me just mention that one of the better commentaries I saw on this comes from our good friend Robert Jeffries, who is the pastor at First Baptist Church, Dallas. And it appeared in Fox News, and he really kind of broke down the Supreme Court decision in three ways. He said there were legal, sociological, and spiritual consequences to this decision. First, he says, consider the legal ramifications of Friday's decision. By enshrining gay marriage as a civil right, the court will be opening a floodgate of litigation against individuals and businesses that refuse to honor same-sex marriages because of religious convictions. After all, gay marriage is a civil right. If gay marriage is a civil right, then anyone who opposes it is guilty of a civil rights violation. We've already seen bakers, florists, wedding chapels sued and in some cases put out of business because of their refusal to participate in gay wedding ceremonies. Expect these suits to accelerate exponentially now that progressives have been emboldened and armed with a Supreme Court decision. He goes on to say, additionally, we can expect both civil and governmental actions against religious institutions that refuse to honor gay marriage as a civil right. During the oral arguments for this case on April 28th, Justice Samuel Alito asked the Solicitor General for the Obama administration, Donald Verrilli, if the decision expanding the definition of marriage would require religious colleges to offer housing to same-sex couples or to risk losing their tax-exempt status. Verrilli responded repeatedly, I don't deny that it's going to be an issue. It's going to be an issue not only for religious colleges, but also for churches that refuse to honor same-sex marriage. I'm repeatedly confronted by the straw man argument that if no one is going to hold a gun to pastors' heads and force them to perform same-sex marriages. Friday's Supreme Court decision represents a collective shaking of our fist in God's face, saying, we don't care what you say about life's most important relationship, we know best. No one is predicting that will happen, but I believe that ultimately churches that refuse to honor same-sex marriage may face government sanctions, including the loss of a tax-exempt status for refusing to honor same-sex unions. Again, Justice Alito pointed out in oral arguments in 1983, the Supreme Court upheld the revocation of the tax-exempt status of a religious organization, Bob Jones University, for prohibiting interracial marriage. If gay marriage has now been elevated to a civil right on par with interracial marriage, what rationale would government have for not revoking the tax-exempt status of any religious organization that does not recognize same-sex unions? The second point he makes is also the impact that it would have sociologically. He quotes from the same person I do. Stanley Kurtz, a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, contends that the legitimization of same-sex marriage unions in Scandinavian countries has caused the heterosexual marriages rate to drop dramatically, while the number of children born out of wedlock has risen, resulting in numerous societal problems. The reason for the drop in the heterosexual marriage rate is clear. If marriage can be redefined to include any and every relationship, then why bother to marry at all? Anytime you counterfeit something, you cheapen the value of the real thing, and gay marriage is counterfeit marriage. Finally, he says, as a Christian, I am most concerned about the spiritual implications of Friday's decision. During the oral arguments for this case on April 28th, Justice Kennedy noted that the traditional definition of marriage has been with us for millennia. It is very difficult for the court to say, oh, well, we know better. Friday, the Supreme Court said, in essence, we know better than God how to define marriage. For thousands of years, both Christians and Jews have believed in both the Old Testament definition of marriage that was written by Moses and affirmed by Jesus himself when he said that God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Jesus taught that sex was a gift of God between one man and one woman in a marriage relationship, and any variation is a deviation from God's original plan for sex. Friday's Supreme Court decision represents a collective shaking of our fist in God's face, saying, we don't care what you say about life's most important relationship, we know best. While Friday's decision by the Supreme Court is tragic, it is ultimately irrelevant. Regardless of what the Supreme Court justices declared Friday, the judge of all the universe has already issued his decision. Marriage should be reserved for one man and one woman, and there is no appealing that verdict. Again, we have that posted on our website if you'd like to find it. A lot of these materials are in the Pray for America section of our website, including a very good video that we have posted by Jack Graham and much more. So let's, if we can, take some more phone calls. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Dee in Texas. Thank you for joining us today. What would you like to add to the conversation?
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question, if it was possible, because of this ruling, will the Christian churches or programs be taken off the radio? And I'd like to say shame on any church because other people are doing it. The Word of God is the very last and the ultimate word. So if they do that, then they're going to be fighting against God as well. And I'd like to say all the voters, the Christian voters, ought to go to the polls. Don't give up.
Dee, appreciate your phone call and some of your comments. First of all, we do need to stand strong, and I think we need to really ask a question even more so. A couple of weeks ago, we had Kelly Shackelford on the program talking about the fact that we really should sort of understand where the various candidates stand on this issue of religious liberty. I know he'll be with us tomorrow, and I know he's going to be saying that with even more force than before, because this is very important, because you can see that there are obvious implications to this and how that could affect churches and other organizations are the case. His argument is this. There are various professions that you have to receive a license for. And so his argument is that maybe some of those professions might ask whether or not you accept the idea of same-sex marriage, or that marriage of two individuals of the same gender is a civil right and a constitutional right. And if you were to say no, they might refuse to issue a license. I don't see that happening right away. I don't necessarily see that even working terribly well, given the place where most Americans are on this issue right now. But that is a possibility. And we have to also recognize that a radio station, in order to receive its FCC license from time to time, has to show that it is demonstrated that it's been working in the interest of the community. You could see the wrong FCC commissioners, and I mean that by some of the ones we have on right now or others that could be put on in the future, arguing that if indeed your particular station from time to time airs some comment about homosexuality on that station, that it should not receive its license. Again, I don't see that one happening tomorrow or anytime soon, but, it, I think, gets back to the big point that you made, Dee, and that is, how do we put people on the FCC board? Well, those are appointed by the president. This next election will be very important in that regard. Let's take a break. We'll take some more phone calls right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
The story earlier this month was that the Treasury Department was planning to take Alexander Hamilton off the $10 bill. An unnamed woman would replace him on the money. The most recent announcement is that his image won't disappear completely, but remain in a secondary way. The announcement from the Treasury Department created a small stir. It would have been a huge controversy if it weren't for the ignorance of most Americans of the contribution of Alexander Hamilton. He fought alongside George Washington as a colonel and provided advice to Washington both as a member of his staff and even later continued in that role when Washington served as his first president. Hamilton wrote 3/5 of the Federalist Papers along with James Madison and John Jay. His writings on judicial review were important in the formation and functioning of the first Supreme Court. We should also mention his other writings. Alexander Hamilton was a journalist and helped found the New York Evening Post. You know it today as the New York Post. These reasons enough should be reasons he should be on our money, but the most important reason is that Alexander Hamilton was the nation's first Treasury Secretary. Most people credit him with saving the country from our first debt crisis and establishing a national bank. His place in history should be secure, but now we are told that he will be replaced by a woman. Here are a few women who have been mentioned. Alice Paul, Phyllis Wheatley, Deborah Sampson, Sylvia Rivera, Lydia Maria Child, and Sojourner Truth are not exactly household names. A few other women you might have heard about are Harriet Tubman, Susan B. Anthony, and Eleanor Roosevelt. Here's a possible test. The woman to replace Hamilton should at least have read the 85 Federalist Papers he wrote and know something about judicial review and the banking system that Alexander Hamilton helped create. Few, if any, of these proposed nominees could pass that simple test. I'm not ready to replace America's first Treasury Secretary who wrote a majority of the Federalist Papers with someone who never even read the Federalist Papers. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Kelly Shackelford and Ken Blackwell yesterday wrote a piece that appeared in Investors Business Daily, and one of the lines kind of gets back to what Dee mentioned just a minute ago. They say, if politicians and courts do not reverse court, of course, let me say that again. If politicians and courts do not reverse course, we will see civil disobedience on a massive scale by devout Christians peaceably following the church's biblical teachings on marriage. The Supreme Court and the American people at the polls in 2016 need to decide whether this country will respect their First Amendment rights, including their fundamental right to dissent. So we'll see how that plays itself out, and we'll certainly have some commentary tomorrow from Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter, who will be in studio with us. Let's, if we can, take some more phone calls. We'll head out to Arizona this time. And Wayne, you're on the program. What would you like to add?
I would like to uncomplicate matters in my own mind by asking several different questions. Am I a Christian or am I not? What does God's Word say and what does it not say? Am I going to follow God's Word or am I going to follow man's devices? And I think that uncomplicates the thing for myself and should uncomplicate things for all Christians.
I'm a simple man. That's kind of how I look at it, as somebody that grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area and had uncle that was a homosexual and went for sometimes to a very liberal Methodist church across the street from the University of California at Berkeley. I had a very different view than I have right now. Now, what changed that? Well, I read books like Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis and Basic Christianity by John Stott and became a Christian. And then I began to read the Bible seriously, and I began to read other books, and I began to grow in my faith, and I changed a lot of views that I had. And that all was due to what? Becoming a Christian. And the sad reality, Wayne, is that a lot of people call themselves Christian right now, and it really doesn't mean the same thing. I mean, if you're on Facebook like I am and the social media like Point of View is, and I'm, always like to see what people are saying, so I subjected myself to looking at Twitter posts and Facebook posts and Instagram pictures and all the rest. You see all sorts of people saying, well, I'm a Christian and I believe in same-sex marriage. And I go, so what does that mean? I mean, first of all, you got to recognize that when people tell us that a majority of Americans accept same-sex marriage, those polls, as I pointed out a couple of weeks ago in my commentary, are what are called a social desirability bias. If you call somebody up on the phone and say, do you believe that same-sex marriage should be legal, or do you approve of same-sex marriage, and you're on the phone with them, I'll guarantee you there's a higher percentage of individuals that say yes, because they sort of feel that's the answer they're supposed to give. They don't want to look like they're intolerant. They don't want you to argue with them, so they'll say yes. But when they actually do those surveys online, especially when people know they can remain anonymous, or when we see how they go to the polls, after all, remember, 41 million Americans, when given an opportunity, voted to define marriage as one man and one woman. And I don't think that many people have changed their minds, even though these polls tend to look like they have. You have to understand that. But back to the point that you made, Wayne, it's a good point. Am I a Christian? Am I going to take it seriously? And I think eventually the word Christian is going to have very little meaning, because you're going to have people that say they're Christians, but they support same-sex marriage and all sorts of other things. Or maybe this will cause us to clarify what it means to be a Christian. And a lot of people that have been calling themselves Christians will say, well, I really can't call myself a Christian because, after all, I don't really accept the Bible in its truthfulness. So we'll see where that plays itself out. But nevertheless, there is where we are right now. Let's go back to the phones. Thomas in Georgia, what would you like to add to the conversation today?
How you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. What would you like to share with us?
Well, yes, it hurts me to my heart, for something like this to happen. Supreme Court will legalize this, but that's why the Bible tells us not to build the world, because we have a world government right here in America, because it's just pathetic. And the only thing I know that we are able to do, or we can do, just sit back and wait on God, and He's going to take care of it. Because I myself personally believe that America has almost turned into Sodom and Gomorrah. We are allowing men to marry men and women to marry women. It makes me think about when Abraham went into Sodom to get his nephew Lot. Now here we are in the same predicament today in this country, and people are just going about their daily business. Voting is fine, which I vote all the time. But I look at it now, it just got me to a point where what's the purpose of me voting for somebody when they're going to turn around and accept something like this? That's why the Bible tells us not to be in this world, but don't be of this world.
Yep. But it also tells us to be salt and light. And so I think, I recognize that sometimes our votes don't make an impact, but sometimes they do. And I can tell you that there are certain members of Congress that are really standing strong on this issue, and we need to have more of those. But the other part of this, and what I think all of us can do, is there are people in our sphere of influence that you can talk to and say, I've got really some concerns about this. And what we've been trying to do is give you some good talking points, some good arguments, and help you know how to respond to some of that. Because frankly, politics is downstream from popular culture. And your culture and the world that you're in right now, you have a chance to talk to your children, your grandchildren, your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, your family members about some of this. And that's one of the reasons why we post so many articles on our website, pointofview.net, so that you can read them, maybe post them on your Facebook page, or print them out and copy them and send them out to people, or to pass them around in your Sunday school class. So again, we need to be waiting on the Lord, and I'm waiting on the Lord, and I'm praying. And one of the points that I'm going to make in just a few minutes is we need to be praying unceasingly. That's the advice that Jay Richards gives us. But he also says we need to, in addition to praying unceasingly, we should also act consistently. And so that's important as well. Let's head to North Carolina this time, WGNN. And David, what would you like to add?
Yeah, well, it's real simple. I mean, I've always heard, been told a lot of things about Christianity, but the one true thing about the Christianity is, are you following God's word? Are you going to do what he says? Or are you going to do what somebody else tells you to do in some government? Another thing, this thing that we call a president, do you not know that birds of a feather do flock together? And that's really a bad situation, because if he's flocking together with that bunch of same-sex people there, gay marriage and stuff, then it might not be possible he's the same thing they are, and they may not even be his children.
Well, I've heard that rumor before, but let's take the one that we can look at, and that is the lights in front of the White House. Did anybody notice how they had the multicolored lights in front of the White House? Are they now going to paint the White House with rainbow color? I'd love to get some of your comments about that. But let's see if we can run our way through a few more phone calls here. Let's take Mary in North Carolina. What would you like to add to the conversation?
Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm good.
I would like to say that we need to leave the gay right people alone, because I'm a Christian. I believe in God, and I believe in everything that God says, and I'm going to still be a Christian. I'm going to raise my kids and grandkids. But my thing is that we got the highest divorce rate. We got the highest committing adultery, fornication as woman and man. And my thing is, we're abusing our kids as a woman and man. And God know what their beliefs and things are, and they do have a soul. And I believe in my heart that a lot of them is going to be saved, because they're going to stop their ways. Like we need to stop our ways. And we always bad-mouthing our president. That's another thing. If we don't want to follow a leader, I don't care who, we want to follow everybody but our leader. And it's 438 or 35 congressmen, Senate, and Congress. He did not make the final decision. And he looks so tired and worn. We need to pray for him, because he does not have the last say. And my thing is, too, that we got all these abortions going on. America needs to stop praying and start changing from our wicked ways. We got so caught up into ourselves that we don't realize that God knows everything, see everything, and he is in control. And we got a war right here in America. We worrying about a foreign country and the oil and the gold and the silver. We need our souls. I don't know the word I'm looking for, but our whole thinking need to change, and our ways need to change, and that's all I got to say.
Well, again, I think it's 2 Chronicles 7:14 is a good example. And again, this is something that I've said on the program before. In some respects, when you're fighting the battle on homosexuality and you've already conceded the turf on everything from living together, cohabitation, premarital sex, you mentioned divorce and a few others, as well as the fact that we have had, though we've had a decline in abortions, we certainly have abortion taking place. It kind of gets back to the conversation with at least two of you, and you've heard it said before, that if indeed God does not judge the United States of America, I think he owes an apology to Sodom and Gomorrah. But let's take a break, and if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
It's just really scary to think where I would be if it hadn't been for the influence the Point of View had on my life.
That is Jamie Jordan, a successful businessman who's been listening to Point of View since he was a child. Jamie says this program helped develop his worldview, which is exactly why Kerby does what he does.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
If you believe the next generation needs that education and empowerment, we need to hear from you today. Our fiscal year ends tomorrow, and when you give now, some ministry friends will match your gift. You give 30, they give 30. You give 100, they give 100. Double your impact by giving online at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Or mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
In my childhood, pre-internet, the radio played a fairly large role. I remember hearing Point of View come on the radio and Marlon Maddox and the introduction to global perspectives on what God and his people are doing throughout the earth. Even when I was a young child, and even when that content was almost in the background of family life or of commuting or being dropped off at sporting activities, there was a sense, and it created a sense within me, that there were people in the world who were leading well, following Jesus, communicating the gospel, and applying that to our lives and our cultural experiences. And I think that impact definitely shaped how I thought about my faith, even as a child, and what the Lord expected of me and the community that He would provide around me to fulfill the purposes for my life. All of us need understanding. Scripture says, seek, gain, look for, apply understanding in our lives. And really, understanding is about understanding a narrative, a story, especially in the 21st century where we have so many stories, so much information, so many competing narratives coming against us. We have to understand God's narrative and our role in that. And of course, Christian radio, and specifically Point of View, is touching thousands and millions of lives across the world and equipping people to walk in that worldview.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Let me once again mention some of the articles we've posted on the website because we thought that these would be very helpful to you. And of course, we've already had Travis Weber on, and he's talked a little bit about the threat to the tax-exempt status of various groups and the question of the court. But also one other I'll mention real quickly, and we'll get back to the phones. We have one by Andrew McCarthy. Let's drop the charade. The Supreme Court is a political branch, not a judicial one. And he brings up the same thing that we talked about on Friday with Gary Bauer, and I've also mentioned in my commentary that will come out this week, and that is that on the one hand, Justice John Roberts on Thursday went out of his way to essentially rewrite the Affordable Care Act so that it would actually pass constitutional muster and allow for the paying of these various subsidies in various states that did not have a state exchange. But then on Friday writes, this court is not a legislature. And I love Andrew McCarthy. He says it takes a Clintonian quantum of cheek to pull that off one day and on the next day inveigh against the very thought of it. The point he's making is kind of what Gary Bauer said on Friday. You know, I'd like to have the Thursday John Rogers or Roberts talk to, or maybe have lunch with the Friday John Roberts, because the Thursday John Roberts had no problem at all, basically rewriting the law. The Friday John Roberts said, we aren't supposed to rewrite the law. Huh? I mean, you got to answer that question one way or the other. But nevertheless, we have a full bank of phone calls, and that's why we're going to take some time to hear from you in this last half hour. 1-800-351-1212. In Texas, KAVX. Charlene, thank you for calling today.
Thank you for having me. My concern is, in light of the Supreme Court decision, how that's going to affect our schools and our children.
Yes.
As a grandmother, I am very concerned about those that are promoting and advocating for same-sex marriage, that the next step is to just get into the schools and indoctrinate our children and teach them that this is an acceptable alternative lifestyle. And I'm just really concerned about what we can do to prevent that and to stop that. I've heard in some states that they're teaching them as young as in kindergarten. This morning I've called Governor Abbott's office and asked if they can do anything to stop that. State representatives, senators, I know that Governor Abbott has said that clerks do not have to issue licenses to same-sex couples if it violates their religious convictions. What about parents who their children being indoctrinated violates their religious convictions? I think that we need to have something done to protect our children, our grandchildren, and the children within our community. I don't know what we can do, but we need to do something. We need, as a church, to rise up and to make our voices heard. If it's only 3% of the population that is gay, I don't know if that is even correct. There are so many more Christians. There's so many more people that stand for righteousness. We have got to make our voices heard. If ever the time is now.
Well, Charlene, I appreciate you raising that issue. And I noticed that Focus on the Family put together, 9 ways redefining marriage impacts your world. And the first one they list was harms children. Redefining marriage, they say, denies children of same-sex couples either a mother or a father. Decades of social science research has shown children do the best when they're raised in a home with a married mother and dad. Government policies should reflect the benefits of both a mother and a father. And the point that you're making is that now it is a right. It's almost impossible for a textbook publisher not to provide alternative pictures of marriage and of family. This was already sort of on the horizon when you had Daddy's Roommate and Heather Has Two Mommies, but those were sort of extra books. But now that it has become a constitutional right for two individuals of the same sex to get married, I don't see how you're going to avoid having textbooks try probably really hard, especially with the pressure from gay rights groups, to make sure that you don't just show in a textbook a picture of a father and a mother, but you show two mothers and two fathers and all of the rest. And I think that illustrates, Charlene, why we have to pay a lot more attention to who we elect, for example, to school boards and to state boards of education. You live in the state of Texas, so I'll use that as an example. The State Board of Higher Education, the State Board of Education, these are institutions, but especially the one on education, will determine which textbooks are purchased. And those kind of battles, which have taken place in Austin, will continue to take place, and that's why it's very important. You also mentioned Ken Paxton, who's been on the program. He's Attorney General. I think we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to who the Attorney General is in our state. And so those are just some obvious implications. And tomorrow we'll talk with Kelly Shackelford, because he's been involved in some of those battles having to do with the history standards, what is or is not taught about history. And we'll talk about what ends up in some of these other social science, civics books, and all of the rest. So that is, I think, just one more logical implication from the Friday decision that came down. And let's go back to the phones and give a few more of you a chance to join the conversation. Let's head out to Kentucky this time. Debbie, thank you for calling.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment that since this ruling has been made and so forth, that not all churches do or will be in disagreement with the most recent ruling of same-sex marriage. And just since the ruling, it was brought to my attention that there has been a church that already has a sign outside which states something like this: Jesus had two fathers, and he turned out okay. And it's sad to say that some churches are already embracing and supporting this ruling.
Yes, I know it. And I kind of gave you a short list of those. I'm probably going to, over the next week or so, see if I can compile that, because now many of them are going to come back and make those statements again. But we already have sort of in the conversation today talked about the United Methodist Church, talked about the Episcopal Church and others. And then you have within certain denominations a split. And so that's going to be even more confusing. But my biggest concern, as I've said before, is if the other churches do not stand strong, you're going to be easily pushed over, because I can just see right now gay activists say, well, really, you as a Southern Baptist can't say that because there's a Southern Baptist church down the road that had a same-sex marriage, so how can you prohibit me from having that? Or, I know of a wedding that was held in this particular Catholic church. Matter of fact, almost everybody in that Catholic diocese accepts same-sex marriage. So how can you in this Catholic church, how can you as the priest tell me I can't get married in the Catholic church? And so you can see this is going to be a real significant challenge. And we've talked about this on the program. I'll continue to get into that as we go through. But let's, if we can, give a few more of you a chance to join our conversation. And just a minute ago, we were talking about children. And I think Brenda in Kentucky, I'll stay in Kentucky for just another minute, wanted to address another issue. So, Brenda, you have the floor.
Hello. The biggest reason that the homosexuals wanted to legalize marriage was so that they could legally adopt children. And I would advise people to read Psalms 119, verse 126, that says, "It is time, Lord, for you to work, for they have made void your laws."
Well, again, many homosexual couples, if you want to call them that, actually have been able to adopt. But again, this is a good illustration of what happened on Friday, because another one of the points that Focus on the Family put out was, and it's point number 2, forced conclosures. Faith-based adoption agencies are being forced to close their doors when faced with laws and mandates requiring them to violate their religious beliefs by placing children in homes with same-sex parents. And they say the pressure will increase in the coming days. After the decision that came down in 2003 and was implemented in 2004, one of the first acts that happened in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was the closing down of the Catholic Charities. This is a charity that had existed for 100 years, and yet it was closed down, not because they wouldn't refer individuals. Now, they could not in good conscience actually place a child in a homosexual home, but they were quite willing, at least, to refer individuals to other adoption agencies in Massachusetts that would do so. But that was not enough, and the state of Massachusetts closed them down after 100 years. You can see now that this issue of same-sex marriage is a constitutional right, how that is going to affect other adoption agencies. And, of course, as Brenda pointed out, this makes it a whole lot easier for a homosexual, quote, couple to adopt than ever before. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, I've got quite a number of other phone calls. We'll do our best to get some of those before we wind down for today. If you just joined us, tomorrow we're going to do on a Tuesday what we oftentimes do on a Friday, and that will be our weekend edition, in a sense early, because we wanted to, as we come to the end of the Supreme Court on June 30th, also the end of our fiscal year, I might add as well, bring in Kelly Shackelford, Penna Dexter, look at this decision, and also begin to ask questions about what's next. Up until now, we've been saying, what if? Now we're basically answering the question, what now? Kelly Shackelford's put together some very good material. They've prepared a 5-point plan for the Supreme Court decision and its ramifications. And they have also, and he's also written a piece on what this means for religious freedom. So we'll talk about that with him. But we'll talk with you right after these messages.
Many times, people who are older than me say they have given up hope on America. They don't believe that we can come back from the changes and challenges. The widespread promotion of anti-Christian beliefs is sweeping into courtrooms, schools, newsrooms, and homes. They are pushing to be mainstream and claiming the Bible and Christian beliefs are a thing of the past, or worse, bigoted. It is easy for the older generation to give up when America is so different now from the one they grew up with. But if you give up, where does that leave my generation and the ones behind me? I believe that we should stand and pray. The only one who can fix us and make America a shining light again is God. He promised his plans are to prosper his people and give us a hope and a future. Prayer is the best way we can act on the hope for a future. James wrote, "The fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much." I still believe that. If you believe God will shape the future by the prayers of his people, you can sign up to be a part of the Pray for America campaign at pointofview.net/pray.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're certainly going to spend some time later this week talking about a few other issues. One of those, of course, is what is happening in Greece right now. The debt crisis there has set stocks plummeting. We're going to talk about that. And some people have said the crisis in Greece is due to too much bureaucracy. I think it also is due to too few babies being born as well. The fertility rate there at 1.1, you need about 2.1 to replace your population. So that is certainly an issue. Supreme Court today ruled on the issue of death penalty and the drugs used, and I may get into that later in the week since we have covered that before, but we'll cover that another day. And I wanted to take some time to finish off with some of the phone calls, which are related to the conversation that we're having about the decision that came down on Friday from the Supreme Court. So let's go to Missouri this time, KNEO. Donald, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kirby. Appreciate the chance to talk to you. You asked a while ago, what did your pastors talk about?
Yes.
Yes. And our pastor, he said, read the Constitution. Go back and read the Constitution. And he said, see what it says, and you'll know what's right. And then he said, I go to my Bible. I go to my catechism, because he's a priest. He's a Catholic priest. And he says his bottom line was sort of, we're going to end up in civil disobedience because we must do what our conscience calls us to do. And I believe, you mentioned that some priests or some bishops have approved gay marriage. When the Pope finds out about that, they'll be out of a job.
Well, some of them might, but one of the things that, and again, I'm Protestant, so I don't know the Catholic Church, although I've gone to places like Georgetown and studied under Jesuit priests a little bit. But, we had John Smerick in here, and he was saying that at least some of the land is owned by the diocese. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays itself out, or even how it plays itself out with some of these other Protestant denominations. But this issue of civil disobedience is important because a lot of people are saying, well, what do we do? And I'm afraid that what we'll have are, again, a real division in the body of Christ. You will have some who will just simply say, it's just too high a price to pay. Well, really, is it that big a deal to affirm same-sex marriage? I don't have a problem with that. And they'll go that direction. But then those who don't, there will be obviously a kind of an Acts 5:29, where Peter says, we will obey God rather than men. One of the pieces I was going to get to, but we'll probably talk about it later in the week, is from Rod Dreyer. He says, Orthodox Christians must now learn to live as exiles in our own country. He has a lot there, but I'll summarize it with one of his paragraphs. He said, for one, we have to accept that we really are living in a culturally post-Christian nation. The fundamental norms Christians have long been able to depend on no longer exist. To be frank, the court majority may impose on the rest of the nation a view widely shared by elites, but it is also a view shared by a majority of Americans. There's no widespread popular resistance to the court case. This is the new normal. So what does he suggest? This is why we're going to have this discussion later on, maybe in a week or two, because he said it's time for what I call the Benedict option. In his 1982 book, After Virtue, the eminent philosopher Alistair MacIntyre likened the current age to the fall of ancient Rome. He pointed to Benedict, a pious young Christian who left the chaos of Rome to go into the woods to pray, as an example for us. We who want to live by the traditional virtues, MacIntyre said, have to pioneer new ways, so in community we await, he said, a new and doubtless very different Saint Benedict. And so what he's arguing is that we may just have to even more separate from our society. And since some of you already are saying, I'm really concerned about what my kids might learn in the public schools, I wonder if this will even create a bigger schism between the private schools and the public schools, because up until now, a lot of people said, well, I don't want my kids going to public schools because I don't want them learning situation ethics. I don't want them learning evolution, whatever, fill in the blank. But now the possibility that they could be learning, about homosexual behavior, and that would all be justified by this ruling, I think is a big issue. So, Donald, I appreciate you sharing what your pastor had to say. And just in order to keep the train moving down the road, let me take the next phone call, KBJS in Texas. Lance, what would you like to add to the conversation?
Yes, sir. I think the big loser here is children, and that goes along with what you were saying about the public schools and how it's going to be taught to our children in public school. And I read on World Magazine that the Nevada governor signed into legislation where the families get to choose 90% of their money. They can choose to send their kids to a private Christian school or any school of their choice, and they get to decide on the money. It goes into a savings account. And I would recommend, I'm in Texas, I would recommend that everybody calls Greg Abbott or the representative state or senator and talk to them and see what they think about getting that passed in Texas. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a greater push for school choice, because a lot of parents are going to say, and a lot of grandparents are going to say, it's been bad enough in the public schools, but now even more so. And again, I recognized my listeners right now that are maybe in the Northwest or the Northeast where, basically, let's face it, there's a very small percentage of people who go to church in, say, Vermont or in Oregon. Those are the two states which have the lowest percentage of individuals that go to church. I was trying to explain to some of our friends, we have a traffic jam here in Texas outside some of the churches at noon on Sunday. And there are people that can't get their head around it. And we had some friends that were in, and they just said, you're right. I mean, you got police out here directing traffic. You've got major traffic jams in front of some of these churches at noon on Sunday. I've never seen anything like that. But if indeed the rest of the country becomes like the Northwest or the Northeast, and I think that's a reasonable expectation, if some of the kinds of things that have been taught in the public schools in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts ever since it legalized its same-sex marriage in 2003, happen in other states, you're going to see a greater desire on the part of many parents to put their kids in a private school. So I think we are certainly facing one of those moments where indeed that is the case. I wish I had more time for the other phone calls. I apologize to those of you waiting on the line, but you know what? Tomorrow we will have that opportunity for you again, and we will have Kelly Shackelford of Liberty Institute in studio. We will have Penna Dexter, our co-host, here in studio as well. A little bit later, we'll also be talking by phone with Gary Bauer. And I want to spend some time tomorrow talking about the implications of the ruling, some of which we've touched on today, but also some of the material that the Liberty Institute has put together. Because up until now, this has been kind of like, okay, this is hypothetical. It is no longer hypothetical. We've gone from what if to what now. And so I want Kelly to address that issue. We're going to post some articles, matter of fact, very shortly, so you don't even have to wait till tomorrow to see some of the articles we'll post. One that he has written that appeared in Investors Business Daily, one that comes from their news and kind of their plan to address this issue, the 5-point plan. I'll post some other very relevant articles, and we make those available so that you can make your case. I heard some of you say today, well, what difference does it make to vote? Well, I think it does make a difference. Who you elect is going to be a really significant decision for you to be making this next year. But even apart from that, a lot of the success, if you will, of the same-sex marriage advocates of the so-called gay agenda was they were able to really change popular culture. You have an opportunity to take the material we've provided to you so that you can begin to talk to your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, your family members, and others, and really help them understand why this is an important issue. That's all we have for today. Please take the time to visit the website pointofview.net. We have some action items. We have some videos, including one of Kelly Shackelford talking about this decision from the Supreme Court. And most importantly, we want you to click on that button that says donate. We are now just a little more than 24 hours away from the end of our fiscal year end, and we certainly need to hear from you. And again, we have a matching fund that's available, and we encourage you to take action. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Chris for the help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Business owner Jamie Jordan says he had a lot of wrong ideas, things he learned in school which just weren't true. But then he discovered a voice on the radio, and it changed his thinking and changed his future.
I started listening to Point of View in 1985. Marlon Maddox was the host back then, and I remember that he used to call it the head in the sand club, that his kind of mission in life was to pull people's heads out of the sand. And my head certainly was in the sand. And it's just really scary to think where I would be if it hadn't been for the influence of Point of View had on my life.
Our listeners have been inspired to do amazing things in business, in education, and ministry in their families. And if you believe that should continue, then please help us before our fiscal year ends tomorrow. Every gift you give will be matched thanks to ministry friends. So double the impact of your most generous gift online at pointofview.net. By mail at Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or by phone 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.